Woo, we're back on the Mile High Hoops podcast, and it was a little bit of an absence from us, I will not lie, but it was not as long of an absence as the Nuggets front office leadership. That was solved earlier today with the Denver Nuggets announcing Ben Tenzer, the former interim GM and the GM of the G League team, the Grand Rapids Gold, will be named or has been named the executive vice president of basketball operations. So we've got that going on. We've got another man coming into the fold. That is Jon Wallace, Jonathan Wallace, the executive vice president of player personnel. AP, two men, one job, it seems, maybe multiple jobs, but we finally have our answer after this giant waiting period of trying to figure out what was going to happen. What are your first thoughts?
It took this long for this? That's kind of my first thought, right? And I had just barely woken up this morning. I'm like doing my morning stretches. I'm like, drinking some water, getting ready to make some coffee. And all of a sudden, like, here comes this news on our timeline, which, we're about 48 hours away here from the NBA draft. So it was bound to happen sooner rather than later here with the Denver Nuggets. But par for the course. That is the terminology I believe I used with you when we were texting about it this morning. That's the terminology I've used with folks here at the Denver Sports 104.3 The Fan Studios. They went cheap. And what's old is new again. The Denver Nuggets, under the leadership of Stan Kroenke back in the day, deployed a similar front office dynamic pre-Masai Ujiri.
Yeah, and that was the first front office that Stan had the decision of making because he inherited the front office before with Dan Issel and Kiki Vandeweghe. So this is a structure that the Kroenkes have had in place before. My first reaction to the structure, not the names involved, the structure was, so you had a conflict that divided the entire organization, and you are going to put two men on opposing sides just to start, and we're going to see how it devolves from there. That is fascinating.
Fingers crossed.
Maybe starting them from the place of being equals with the incentive of you've never had jobs this important will have them collaborating. But that's how me and you and normal people work in their day-to-day jobs. Generally in professional sports, people got egos. I'm not saying that about either of these guys because I know Ben a little bit more than I know Jon Wallace, and I don't take Ben as one of those types of guys, but I'm just telling you, a lot of people want to go say, I signed player A and player A is the reason they won a championship. He wanted them to sign player B. That's my first thought is I was a little bit scared that they have worked themselves into this trap door. I did a little bit more research, thought to myself, well, the on-court results were pretty good during the Carmelo days, the late Carmelo days, which is when they had the structure. But in talking to people around the scenes when I was not back in those days, 2006 to 2010, things got a little bit messy.
Yeah, and I think to take it even a further step in reverse, like you bring up the Calvin Booth dynamic and, obviously what they've done in years past, they're also following a similar blueprint in regards to hiring a coach before they hired an executive. And I understand that Ben Tenzer is now promoted, right? He was the interim GM once Calvin Booth was let go. So it's not like it's total unfamiliarity here. And, it is worth noting here that Jon Wallace spent some time with the Denver Nuggets organization under the command of Tim Conley. So he is a familiar name in and around the building. But maybe a new face, a new name for Nuggets fans that didn't, get into the nuances of front office construction 10 years ago, or whatever it was.
Right. In theory, David Adelman, Ben Tenzer, and Jon Wallace have all worked together already.
Correct. Yeah. So it's interesting, and we'll see what Wallace can do here. It seems like there's some pretty positive reviews from what I've gathered. You mentioned to me that he's a former teammate of Uncle Jeff Green back in the day at Georgetown, I believe, if memory serves me correct. So, there's another connection.
He's a free agent.
So is Gary Harris. So, Bruce Brown's on the short list. We're just going to get the band back together is what it sounds like. Yeah. But here's the thing, dude. You kind of hit on it. Here we go into what I have labeled, you have labeled as well as, arguably the most important offseason in Nuggets franchise history. Nikola Jokic is eligible to sign a contract extension here in a couple of weeks. That has to be priority number one, assuming nothing happens with the draft, which is in 48 hours. So we'll see what happens there. But I think getting Nikola to sign on the dotted line to this contract extension will be test number one. Not that it should be much of a test. It should frankly be more of a formality. But if Nikola is a little hesitant, not saying that he will be, to sign this extension, that gets Nuggets Nation worried a little bit. So outside of the draft, priority number one has to be getting the big fella locked up for years to come.
Yeah, we're going to know pretty early on in July here whether or not Nikola Jokic approved of these moves. However, I don't think they make these moves without Nikola Jokic signing off on them. So Jonathan Wallace is obviously someone he would know because he worked for the Nuggets. Jon Wallace, from what I've gathered in just, a couple hours of research here, is a very well-connected man, especially through player circles. Well, and that's something the Denver Nuggets very badly needed. So Nikola Jokic, being one of the most important players in the league, obviously knew who this guy was. And being, very close with Jeff Green, as Nikola Jokic was, and, running in the same circles as DeAndre Jordan and stuff, he would know Jon Wallace. So I think that Nikola Jokic probably has already signed off on this move. Now, the question is, will he sign off to the tune of $212 million for his future contract earnings? I have some questions about that. I don't think Nikola Jokic is really going to go anywhere, but ultimately, you've put the offensive coordinator of the Denver Nuggets, the G League GM of the Iowa Wolves, the G League GM of the Grand Rapids Gold in charge of the second half of Nikola Jokic's prime. Those are indisputable facts. These are all first-timers. And some will say they needed to go out and do something more expensive, go get, maybe Tom Thibodeau to be the head coach and bring back Bob Myers to be the GM. I'm not sure. Something along the lines of that. I don't think that was ever on the table for this organization and the way they've been known to operate for such an extended amount of time. Now, this was maybe the cheapest option. I don't know if it was the cheapest. It was among the cheapest options. Some fans will be crying, cronky poor on that. It doesn't mean it wasn't the best option. I'm not here to tell you today it was a bad decision or a good decision. I'm not sure yet. I haven't even had a conversation in a press conference with these guys yet. All I can tell you is they went from having a very insular front office in Calvin Booth and a guy who didn't have many relationships around the league. And now they keep the guy who does a lot of the business and contract stuff, the stuff that, frankly, most people don't understand, in Ben, and they add a guy who does a lot of that interpersonal relationships and talks across the league guy. So I think that this could be a very positive thing for the Nuggets. It is a very unknown water. It is taking a chance because all of these entities are unknown, from David to Ben to John.
Yeah, it's interesting. And, there's a couple of good points that you make. I want to go back to the cheap conversation from Kroenke. What is interesting? There wasn't many candidates. You heard some rumors about Bob Myers, but the one external candidate that I feel like we had some steam or some buzz to also happens to work for the Minnesota Timberwolves, and that's their current acting general manager, Matt Lloyd. So now, obviously, like at first when I saw this news come out, I had to remind myself, I'm like, was this Matt Lloyd? Is this the guy we were talking about? Obviously, it's not. It's Jon Wallace. So going back to the cheap conversation for just a moment, maybe they tried to make a similar offer to Matt Lloyd of like, hey, we want to go this combo role. You handle basketball operations. Ben will handle the business and the finances. And maybe Matt said no, so that they maybe go down the pecking order one and take a look here at Wallace, who they ended up on. So read into that as you may, but the one guy outside of Bob Myers, outside of the organization, that had any sort of connection, any sort of steam to the Denver Nuggets outside of those living on a prayer for Tim Conley, was their current general manager, Matt Lloyd. So the fact that they didn't get him but stayed within the Timberwolves organization, read into that a little bit. Tells me something.
Yeah, I think they missed him. That's part of it. I did
hear. Probably said, here's Jon Wallace. He's a great guy. I work with him in Denver, so you know him. You should hire this guy. That's how I believe that conversation had to have gone down. No,
and from what I know, at least, obviously the relationship was left in maybe not the best place possible because some of the comments Josh and Tim both made on their way out the door. But at least before that, they were very close. So I would say that maybe, all is fair in love and war, and these guys probably made up and had some conversations. So I wouldn't be surprised if Tim recommended this person for this job. And obviously Tim still loves Denver and has a lot of care for these guys. I mean, I've seen him in the Nuggets locker room as frequently, as recently as like last year. So this is not an adversarial relationship, at least from what I understand. And you also have to keep in mind with Jon, not only was he a teammate of Jeff Green, and I kind of circle those dots, he was a point guard on a Final Four team his junior year. He had a game-winning shot against North Carolina, an important play in the 2007 NCAA tournament. Comes back a year later, loses to Steph Curry's Davidson team. He was the guy guarding him for big stretches of that game in 2008. Who is he being coached by? John Thompson III. John Thompson II, John Thompson Jr., was still around for most of that era. He wasn't, he was still alive, which meant Red Auerbach was still around. Bill Russell was still around. Some of these lessons that were taught to John Thompson Jr. were being taught to Jon Wallace. So when we talk about Calvin Booth and we were like, okay, yeah, he played basketball in the NBA and whatever, you couldn't even find pictures of it. Like, he was around, but it wasn't like he was as connected and you could hear things around the league. I go and read just like a couple page results on Google about Jon Wallace, and you're already getting connected to Red Auerbach. I feel like that's a little bit better of a situation for what the Nuggets need. Now, going back to the point that you just made, though, about, maybe it was a Bob Myers, they could have gotten a big name, yada, yada, yada. Let alone splitting responsibilities and being put into this situation with Ben Tenzer, which may not be the best situation possible for, a guy wanting to be the GM and the head and the number one somewhere else, right? What does this role really allow you to do? You're going to want to sign Nikola Jokic to a long-term extension. Yes. You have some pretty big decisions to make right away with Peyton Watson and Christian Brown that could go any number of directions. You don't have any draft picks to trade. You don't even have any picks to draft in this year's draft. You don't have any salary cap space, and you're so close to the second apron that you don't even know if you can actually use the mid-level exception. So what's the attractive level of this job? The answer to me was 0. Some people thought, it's the second half of Nikola Jokic's prime. You've got a great player. They've taken care of the hard things. Just like when Calvin Booth inherited the team, we'll always say he was the GM for the Nuggets when they won the championship. It was Tim's team. It's still Tim's team, right? Like, it's still Tim's team. So I don't know that there's all that much attraction to this job, not only because of Kroenke and the money and all this other stuff, but because of where the Nuggets are from a basketball perspective in terms of the collective bargaining agreement right now.
Yeah, I think if we take it at a surface level, right, I think the idea of being the captain of the ship, that Nikola Jokic is on is attractive regardless of what it is. But I think, to your point, the Nuggets are just simply stuck. Like they don't have moves to make. You talked about the draft capital. You talked about, Peyton Watson and Christian Brown's looming contract extensions. We know MPJ and Jamal Murray are virtually untradeable. So there's really no seismic moves to, have a new GM like a Bob Myers type come in here and put his fingerprints on and call it his. This is really a maintenance type of role. And I don't mean that in a bad way. And I think the way that I look at the Jon Wallace situation as well as the Ben Tenzer promotion here is you've got to be cautiously optimistic. Like, I think everything that I've picked up on, that you've talked about, that we've shared on this show and in private as well, seems like Jon Wallace has got his head on straight. He has a lot of strengths that Calvin Booth did not. So you're getting an upgrade in regards to familiarity around the league, relationships around the league, relationships with players. That's all great. But again, if it was Bob Myers, and I don't want to make this the Bob Myers show, he can't do much more than Jon Wallace is going to be able to do. And that's the thing, is I know that Jon Wallace is executive vice president is his official term, along with Ben Tenzer. He is the acting general manager. Like, Ben Tenzer, as I said earlier, from what I've heard, will handle the finances and the off-the-court stuff. Jon Wallace will be the guy talking at the trade deadline, talking draft night, wheeling and dealing on some of these moves for the Denver Nuggets. So Jon Wallace, when it comes to roster construction and trades, that's the guy you're going to be looking at. But they're also both, in Ben Tenzer and Jon Wallace, all roads lead back to Josh Kroenke. It seems like Josh Kroenke is going to be taking a little bit more of a hands-on approach here. But I'm, like I said, cautiously optimistic. I mean, he checks all the boxes, has the experience, has the relationships. I don't know how much he can do, But where we kind of started this show, signing Nikola Jokic to a contract on July 8th is what I believe the day he becomes eligible to sign that deal has to be priority number one. If that is not done in swift order, I start to get a little nervous.
Yeah, so just one more thing on Jon Wallace. Here's a quote from John Thompson III in 2007 when Jon Wallace was point guard. Quote, "You win with people like Jon Wallace. You look at him, he's not the fastest person in the world. He's not the strongest person, never will be, but he has character, he has guts, and he's a good man. He's willed his way through so many situations." For those who do not know, Jon Wallace was recruited to Princeton by John Thompson III. John Thompson III takes the job at Georgetown before Jon Wallace can even step on campus. He says, "I want to follow you to Georgetown." John Thompson says, "I don't have a spot for you." Says, "You can walk on." Walks on. A year later, he earns a scholarship, and again, he becomes the starting point guard for that Georgetown team that was so good. And some other notes that I kind of found while browsing: he's a big defense-oriented guy. He's from Alabama, and that's all I kind of have at the current moment.
We got a press conference tomorrow, so we'll learn some.
And I do find what you say to be very interesting and some stuff that makes sense as well, which is, it seems to me that when you think about what a traditional GM does, Jon Wallace is basically that, with Ben Tenzer fulfilling some of those obligations, but maybe even being a half step ahead of him in terms of the leadership of where the organization is. I'm not going to think of Ben Tenzer like a president, but to me, it's, both of them are going to be reporting to Josh Kroenke, but I think Ben Tenzer's spoke on the wheel is going to be a little bit closer to Josh's than where Wallace's is, if that makes sense. He's going to be a little bit higher up, but maybe not necessarily his boss. So, we all have these situations with different people in departments at our workplace, right? Where me and Aniello have the same boss. There are bosses in other departments. Maybe that boss is a little bit closer to the actual higher up boss than our boss is. So that happens in workplaces. So that this isn't too unheard of. And in the perspective of the executive is becoming a lot more important in the NBA, I think that this is a situation that could answer that call by diluting some of the power of the executive becoming so important. I don't think that Josh Kroenke wants someone that is a all-willing, all-powerful person again. Like Michael Malone was that. George Karl was that. Tim Connelly was becoming that, right? Like, I think Josh Kroenke wants the final say on a lot of things in the Nuggets organization. And unlike all these other organizations that he runs and he's connected to, this is his baby. He is a basketball fan. And to me, this is what's important to Josh is the Denver Nuggets. So whether or not, it's Josh running things or whatever, I don't think Josh has the time to run things. But do I think Josh gets asked about Nikola Jokic's extension for $212 million? Do I think Josh gets asked about whether or not they want to trade MPJ? I think that was happening before, and it's going to happen after. So I'm not too concerned with the titles. I know they over there, they are really interested in the titles. We get emails about the titles. They care about the titles. I'm interested in the actuality of how this actually works. And to me, this actually isn't that crazy of a situation. It's just the titles are a little bit weird. I know I just talked a lot, but I didn't really give you a question. So I'm going to give a little bit of a breakdown on Ben Tenzer as well. Ben is one of the longest tenured employees of the Denver Nuggets. Ben has been around since the early 2000s. He has worked his way up through this organization. He was most recently the Grand Rapids Gold GM. He has worked in scouting. He has worked as like a legal guy for them on contracts. He has been their CBA and their cap guru for basically 15 years now. He is a very good guy. I have a really good relationship with Ben, and I'm very happy for him on a personal side of things. He has earned this opportunity. So you can kind of feel good if you're a Nuggets fan that some of that culture that made that 2023 team so special is being recreated with Ben, John, and David. Now, some people say we need to change things. It's so broken. I tell you, they were a couple plays away from beating the team that won the NBA championship. And yeah, everyone around the West is getting better. Maybe Houston, not everybody. So thoughts on the last 4 minutes of my spiel?
No, I think you make some good points. And I'll kind of throw it right back to you as well. Let me get this one out there. the one piece of Nuggets news, no pun intended, the nugget we got last week is Tommy Balcetis was no longer with the organization. And Tommy Balcetis was, a highly regarded young and up and coming mind. I believe I saw that he was listed on Forbes top 40, rising executives across the league as well, so it kind of checks those boxes. So in theory, you could have just kept Ben and put Tommy in the exact same situation that you just hired Jon Wallace for. So why is Jon Wallace a better, fit for this type of role versus a guy like Tommy Balcetis with the Ivy League background, having been in the organization, that fabric of that championship season as well? I think these are all very valid questions to ask as well. But you made a good point about the ever-growing importance on league executives around the NBA. And you and I had talked about this a handful of different times as the season was winding down and in our early off-season shows as well. Sam Presti's getting all the reward right now for what he's done. I know he hasn't won yet, but Dale Morey, a highly regarded executive around the league. Pat Riley, what he's done with Miami. You go back to Bob Myers working under Jerry West in Golden State to kind of build that out. So now I guess where I come back to is Josh fancies himself a basketball man. I don't think either one of Ben or Jonathan are going to have one hand tied behind their back. I think they're going to be allowed to do what they want to do as long as they get the approval from Josh here. But does that concern you at all? Tim Conley in Minnesota, because it seems like, having one guy at the top that calls the shots is working out for a lot of these different NBA teams, and the Nuggets a little bit unwilling to go, that far into it with this type of move. So are you at all concerned with the lack of a true identity, or that identity rather being Josh Kroenke is still kind of the leader of the ship in the front office?
No, because I think they have the answers of what they're trying to do, right? I like Tommy a lot. I thought Tommy was a rising executive. I actually thought Tommy was going to get this job when I found out Cal didn't have it. But Tommy's a little bit more on the scouting side, whereas John seems to be more on the player management side, and it's not that big of a difference, but it's a little bit of a difference. And maybe this is just simply we're picking one, and then we have to go outside for the other guy because we need a little bit of new life here. We've gone internal for everything. And granted, John's not that much of an external candidate given he worked here 3 years ago, but it is something new. And obviously the Kroenkes were unhappy with the structure to begin with, given they've restructured everything and the fact that they fired Calvin Booth to begin with. So I think they were just looking for something new. So I don't know how to completely answer your question at this given moment. But I do think that there's reason to believe that they've set themselves up to succeed. But again, I go back to what I said to start the podcast. They have put themselves in a position starting from perhaps conflict rather than resolution and clear pecking order. Now, can that work? Well, you look across town with Denver Broncos. It's working well so far with Peyton and Peyton. And it wasn't working well when Peyton was Hackett's boss. Whether or not that was Peyton or Hackett's fault, I'm not sure. So maybe this kind of co-tandem thing can work. And granted, these NBA organizations are supposed to be like large cruise ships, all heading in the same direction. You're supposed to have the captain, the co-captain who comes on at night and steers a little bit. And then you're supposed to have the second mate and the third mate and blah, blah, blah. Last year, it was just Calvin out here running the whole thing, and he ran it into the ground. And part of this to me is a direct reaction to the fact that reportedly Calvin made the Reggie Jackson trade without anyone's approval, without notifying anyone in the organization, not ownership, not anyone else at the front office, not Michael Malone, that he was shipping him out for 3 second-round picks. Given the Nuggets' current structure, it seems impossible for anyone to be acting alone now. It seems they are going to be forced to collaborate, and that could create conflict or it could create a better working situation. But they've already been working on things, Aniello, because of one of the nuggets that came out over the weekend as well, that they were one of the wild card suitors for Kevin Durant, which means somebody was on the phone. And now we know that person was likely Ben Tenzer. AP, do you think they actually seriously were involved and interested in bringing Kevin Durant to the Mile High City?
I do. And I think they would have been a little bit more active and a little bit more interested had they had their leadership structure in the front office set in stone. Before, interim GM Ben Tenzer, who's now in, a similar role, like it was just very discombobulated behind the scenes. Now, look, I think Phoenix got absolutely fleeced in the deal for Kevin Durant. I mean, they probably would have gotten a much better return had Kevin Durant been willing to go to Minnesota. All signs point to it seemed like those two were pretty close on a deal before Kevin Durant shut it down. So I don't know how competitive of a package the Nuggets could have put together compared to that of Houston. Jalen Green, the first round pick, this, that, and the other. But I would think that they would have had a better chance to really be in the conversation for Kevin Durant if they had their leadership situation figured out.
Yeah, I would agree with that, because maybe Kevin Durant likes the person here and wants to come here, because Kevin Durant, as it's being reported today, kept saying no to trade offers, including to Houston, until they got pennies on the dollar for him. But let's just say Kevin Durant wanted to come here. The Nuggets' best offer is one we already know, which is a 2030 first-round pick, Michael Porter Jr. or Jamal Murray, throw one of the two in there. Plus, they have to have contracts of like Zeke Naji and Dario Saric to get up to the KD level. And then you're probably throwing Christian Brown and a first-round pick from, 2031. And if you waited till Wednesday night, you could have included a second-round pick. They got 5 second-round picks. They got the number 10 pick in the draft. They got Jalen Green, who's, I'm not a big fan of him, but he could be an all-star. Like, that is potential for him. And then Dylan Brooks, who is a self-described, the Suns wanted more ruggedness to their team. Like they, maybe they're all 6'5" and shooting guards on that roster, but Dylan Brooks was a team need that they had. So from the Suns' perspective, they don't know if that 2030 pick is going to be a top 10 pick from the Denver Nuggets. They also have a limited time clock on Devin Booker right now, and they need an asset in the door today. Jalen Green is a better player today than Christian Brown is. Like, that is indisputably true.
Has more trade value. And has more trade value, because it seems like Phoenix might just try to flip him and get more assets.
Correct. And are you going to take on the negative contract value of Michael Porter Jr. so you have that and Bradley Beal? So I don't think that this trade was ever going to happen for the Denver Nuggets. However, it is fascinating for the second year in a row, just as they were interested in Paul George last year, they were sniffing around this territory. And it leads me to believe that they do know that they could make a big swing, but maybe they're hesitant to do so, and they should be, because those big swings, we can see how they play out. We've had this conversation. Milwaukee's backed themselves into a corner. Phoenix backed themselves into a corner, right? These teams sometimes back themselves into a corner, and then there's no way out, and then all of a sudden your superstar is being traded like Kevin Durant. So I'm not a big fan of getting KD in here. KD's one of my favorite players ever. I talked about it around the trade deadline a lot, but I didn't think that there was a huge upside to bringing KD in here, given the circumstances that the Nuggets had right now. But I think it would be a giant mistake to go down the rabbit hole and say, well, we couldn't get KD. Now let's get the second best option, which would be like a DeMar DeRozan. I think the Nuggets are far better off with Michael Porter Jr. than DeMar DeRozan.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I like DeMar DeRozan, but here's the thing. It ain't happening. It is going to be the core five. It's going to be probably Bruce Brown. It's going to probably be maybe Gary Harris, and then maybe bring back Jeff Green. Like, I really think I'm not seeing a huge move or two to be made, and define huge however you want. But I think any moves that they do make could be, getting the band back together here a little bit. Maybe a free agent here, a free agent there that hasn't played for the Nuggets before. But again, kind of bringing it back to the conversation as a whole, the word of the day, stuck. That is where the Denver Nuggets are right now. You've got Nikola, you've got Jamal and MPJ. Christian, you don't have to sign him this offseason, but you risk the price going up if he plays better this coming season. So, it kind of is what it is. And we'll have to see how Denver moves forward, with this roster. They're probably going to run it back. I don't think it's the worst thing in the world. I know it's frustrating for a lot of fans out there, but what do you want to do? That was the first thing that I said in kind of my reaction video that I did for us here is the new GM, the new front office, they very limited options is what they have. They could try to, get a second round pick in Wednesday's draft, but outside of that, not a whole lot of work to be done, not a whole lot of maintenance to be done. So, and
one of the reasons why they're even more stuck today than they were maybe a week ago is because Dario Saric picked up his option over the weekend. I can't fault a guy for making $5 million for free. Can't do it. Yeah,
I do the same thing.
Happy for Dario. But he is going to find himself in a peculiar position if he actually wants to play basketball this year, because the Nuggets don't have the assets to get off Dario Saric and move him to a team who can then cut him. That means the Nuggets would then have to cut him. I believe they can stretch that out over 2 years instead of just one, which means you're basically taking a $2.5 million cap hit over 2 years rather than one $5.5 million cap hit. So that might be something the Nuggets consider just to get the roster spot back, because right now, as of today, they only have 3 roster spots. It's DJ's spot, it's Vlatko's spot, and it is Russell Westbrook's spot. And that's another spot that, again, they've backed themselves into a corner. Their 6th man from last year is a free agent, and their only avenues to get him back are to offer him another minimum contract, which actually pays him more cash value than if he had just accepted the player option. That's why he didn't, if he's coming back. Secondarily, they can offer him a slight raise off of early bird rights or non-bird right extension. I'm not exactly sure what the terminology is, but it's a 20% raise. Or they could offer him the full mid-level exception, which is what me and you are hoping they offer Bruce Brown. Now, me and you have said over and over again, we've gone back and forth on whether or not we want Russ back. I'm pretty clear on the side that I don't want Russ back, but into the context of this conversation, they definitely need more production off their bench, and that's one of the first priorities after the Nikola Jokic stuff, given for these 2 men that are now running the Denver Nuggets front office. And they're going to need a scour. And granted, Ben Tenzer seems to have been working as the GM for a while now. And it's not like Jon Wallace doesn't know the marketplace, because he's been involved in it in Minnesota. So at least they're not pulling, that was one of my concerns about Bob Myers. Just honestly, AP, is if they brought Bob Myers in today on Monday and the draft was on Wednesday, what kind of scouting work had Bob Myers done? What kind of scouting work on not only drafted players, but free agents around the league that maybe weren't getting enough playing time? Like, for instance, there's a guy on Houston that I really like, that I think is going to be an odd man out in this situation, and that's a good roster. And I like pecking around these teams that got a lot of guys and there's odd men out, whether it's Oklahoma City and, you find a guy like Ty Jerome who falls off their roster, and look at him now for Cleveland. One of those guys for Houston, in my opinion, is going to be Jayshawn Tate, who's a really good player. But I don't have the basketball pedigree to go out and say, all right, let me scout to see if he's actually a good player still, and Houston was just misusing him or whatever. I believe that Ben Tenzer and Jon Wallace already know the answer to whether or not Jayshawn Tate is a still good player. I don't think that would have been the case for Bob Myers, who's been working in TV for a year and a half. So there are some upsides to this move that the Denver Nuggets made, and we will find out more about it tomorrow in a press conference. And then after that, we're going to find out the first moves made by Wallace and Tenzer, the brain trust, on Wednesday and Thursday during the NBA draft, when traditionally a lot of moves get made. The Nuggets do not have a pick, but I would not be surprised if they sign a two-way guy, a two-way player off of an undrafted situation or something like that in the coming days. Summer League is actually going to be kind of interesting for the Nuggets this year, because they've got those 3 two-way spots. And
is Durant Holmes playing in Summer League?
I would assume so. There was talk of him doing that. We're going to ask that question tomorrow. That's going to be one of the things that gets talked about. But we are going to talk to you Thursday after the NBA draft. That is our current plan. So we'll do that then. Free agency, believe it or not, opens up in 7 days, I believe, AP. Is that right? July 1st and
right.
today's the 23rd. So we will likely talk to you again on Thursday, Tuesday, maybe next Thursday as well. So we are back, at least for the short time in the summer when the NBA offseason heats up. Congratulations to the Oklahoma City Thunder. They went out and earned a championship. I feel horrible for Tyrese Halliburton, who's one of my favorite players in the league. And
you think Indiana wins that game if he doesn't get hurt?
No,
I don't. I agree.
But it's going to be one of the biggest what ifs in NBA history. It just is, and that championship will have an asterisk. Unfortunately for the Nuggets, I think that the Thunder are probably going to get another championship to prove that championship did not matter with its asterisk. But Alex Caruso, every championship he earns is going to have an asterisk on it. So that's just the way it is. Anyway, he's Aniello Piro. I'm Jake Shapiro. We will talk to you again on Thursday with a lot of information then. Chat soon.
Peace.